right, so we've got a few questions. I think these questions that we have, I think I actually have 9 of them, and I think that they more or less represent, the various categories of questions that we received. So we'll start with the most serious one. Do you drink Bud Light?
Is Bud Light a drink? Goodness gracious. No, but it's nothing to do with the current problems. I just don't think it's drinkable.
So here is a more serious question. Sexual mores are changing at breakneck speed. Where sexual deviants of yesterday are celebrated today, what taboo area is next, and where do you think it will end?
Yeah. I think pressure is going to legitimate pedophilia at this point. I don't know if it will succeed, but the advent, it's always interesting to look at linguistic shifts, because linguistic shifts often create pressure for legitimation. And the advent of the term minor attracted person is interesting, as is youth attracted person. And I was reading just this week, there's been an attempt to, every year the pride flag changes these days. And an attempt has been made to try to include some sort of stripe or symbol that represents youth attracted people, which is essentially, it's not quite pedophilia. I think technically speaking, pedophilia is a sexual relationship with a prepubescent child. I mean, I don't want to get too distasteful, but yeah. I think a 20-year-old sleeping with a 15-year-old girl, that's not technically pedophilia. It may be something we don't approve of. But I think pedophilia, for a couple of reasons, pedophilia or incest. One, sexual ethics hangs an awful lot on, or has hanged an awful lot on the issue of consent over the last couple of decades. And one thing that the #MeToo movement has demonstrated is that consent is an extremely complicated thing to parse. What does it mean when a very powerful Hollywood mogul demands that a young, powerless girl who's desperate to get into movies sleep with him, and she says yes? Is that consent? I think that's an interesting question. And secondly, we have never regarded consent of children as being absolutely necessary for the way we treat children. They don't have to consent to go to school to have to go to school. My kids did not have to consent to eat their greens for me to make them eat their greens. They did not have to consent to bedtime for me to enforce the bedtime on them. So we have not exalted children's wills and consent to be completely sacrosanct and non-negotiable. All you really need is for somebody to come along and say that for this child, it would actually be really good for them to have a sexual relationship and win that argument for pedophilia, I think, to fall. Incest, I can't understand why incest is still illegal, actually. I'm glad it is, but if the couple are adults, if they consent, if they use contraception, why not? Now, I'm not advocating that, but I'm saying, given legal and cultural precedents in the United States today, why not? One of the traditional reasons incest is taboo is it could lead to genetic problems in children. Well, okay, the guy gets a vasectomy. A woman has her tubes cut, so that's not an issue anymore. If it's what makes them feel great, if it doesn't harm anybody else, if they both consent, why not? So I think incest will likely fall as well. There's the other side of internet pornography, of course, is that the evidence is emerging that the more somebody consumes internet pornography, the more their views of what is and is not sexually acceptable will shift. So I think in a world where an awful lot of people are using an awful lot of pornography, an awful lot of time, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we'll see that working out on the ballot. We'll see that working out in party manifestos. I have no confidence in any political party in the United States because ultimately they all depend upon getting votes to get elected, which means they have to have something of an eye on the way the culture is going. And that so-called Overton window on what is sexually acceptable will be shifting, I think, in a significantly progressive direction.
There's really a series of questions having to do with transgenderism. So you can stop me at some point, but I think I may just go through all of them and then you can address how you'd like. Do you honor the preferred pronouns of trans persons? What practical advice do you have for how to relate to a family member who's transgender? The extended family member who is transgender wants to have a relationship, but our family has a lot of small children. And so how do you, what's the advice?
Yeah, these are hard questions. They're partly hard because I'm not sure that in some circumstances one size fits all. There's always so many complications, particularly in family situations, that it's hard to say, this is the algorithm to use that will give you the right answer. I'll start with the pronouns question. This is one I think I see in the Christian world what I would consider to be good faith disagreement on this issue. So I'll give you my opinion, but I'm still open to talking to those who disagree with me. I think that if I was in a situation where there's somebody standing on a window ledge about to throw themselves off, and the only way I can talk them back in is to use their preferred pronouns, I would do it. I would do it pastorally in that particular situation because the emergency and the extreme nature of the situation, really, it's a small thing to do in order to get that person in off the ledge. Would I do it routinely? I think not. Because I think, again, I'm talking earlier on about be careful what linguistic concessions we make, lest we actually concede sort of metaphysical ground in so doing. I think to use somebody's preferred pronouns is to concede metaphysical territory. It's to confirm them. I won't say the lie, because there are some genuine transgender people out there genuinely confused by the disconnect they perceive between their minds and their bodies. So I'm not impugning their motives in requesting to be called by certain pronouns. But I think if you concede that, you are conceding that their, what I would say, distorted view of reality is a legitimate view of reality. And I think that's a problem. Now, there are those out there who would hold very much my opinions on transgenderism, but may pastorally disagree with me on that point. So that's one to wrestle with. I would have no problem in using somebody's name. If Dave suddenly becomes Davina and wants me to call him Davina, that's not a problem. I might think it's silly. But for family reasons, on the other side of the family, my granddaughter's middle name is James. She's got a guy's name. A name is just a name. Johnny Cash, boy named Sue. I think a name is just a name. A pronoun carries more significance. It's more loaded. The issue of family members, I don't think I could really opine on that because I think families are so complicated. What I would say is, in my mind, the thing that would be driving me is I cannot ultimately indulge this person in a harmful fantasy, but I do want to continue a family relationship with them. How you square that circle may look different, may not even be possible in some circumstances, but I would want to be infinitely compassionate. Now, if we're dealing with a child, somebody under the age of 18, I would fight tooth and nail to stop them doing anything that would permanently alter their bodies. There's part of me that thinks, hey, if you're 25 and you want to transition, I think you're wrong. I don't think it will solve the problem that you think you have. But it's a free country, and if the insurance company will pay for it, I think we do need to fight hard on children. We live in a nation where, last time I looked, in none of the 50 states is it legal for a child to have a tattoo under the age of 18. But there are 16-year-olds in this country having their breasts removed. I think that's insane. That's a country that is dying at that point on the horns of its own contradictions. So I think if we're dealing with children in a family situation, you need to get help. There are groups out there, support groups for parents facing this kind of thing. Get in touch with them. They're easy to find on the web. If you can't find them, drop me a note. I can send you to the websites. Get help, get support. Take advice, not from me, but from people who've gone through it themselves and who can tell you what works, what doesn't work, what happens when you do this, what happens if you don't do that.
Good. Okay, so this is a long question, longest one we got. So you've identified expressive individualism as a key factor in why we are where we are today. But do you think to contrast expressive individualism with a completely non-individualistic expression of society turns a blind eye to the overwhelmingly harmful experience that people who vary from the societal norm have experienced? And the person goes, they say, I worry that the downfall of this response has the danger of minimizing giving honor to God creating man and woman individually, with the interrelation between individuals as a key aspect of mankind's existence. You know, with this dilemma in mind, what might be a...
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, my comment about freedom and belonging sort of touches on that. We are free, we belong. And there's always this tension or pressure in human existence between being an individual and being part of something larger than ourselves. I give one of my humanities lectures at Grove has the slightly facetious title, Why Do All Teenagers Dress the Same? And I use the idea of conformity among teenage dress to bring out this idea that you talk to a teenager and they'll tell you, hey, my clothing is an expression of the real, authentic me. So why do you look like all your pals, is the sort of follow-up question. And that goes to the heart of how we want to be free and individual. We also want to be corporate. More general point I would make here is this. I don't think that expressive individualism is necessarily right or wrong. I just think it's a thing. I think in any given human society, there will be a normative view of what it means to be a human being. And I think human sin will distort that and use it for its own ends. So in a strongly corporate society, you could find, the sort of nightmare scenario that might be being hinted at here is somebody who's different suddenly finds themselves being marginalized for no other reason than the fact they're different. Finds themselves being subject to persecution, perhaps, in most extreme cases. The Jews and the Holocaust would be perhaps the most horrible or horrifying example of recent memory. That's not a good thing either. That kind of corporatism, that's not a good thing either. What I'm trying to do is say, in any society we live in, we need to understand the underlying pathologies. And then we need to see how does sin, if you like, get hold of these things and distort them for evil. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is writing his first and second discourse and his other works in the 18th century at about the same time that Jonathan Edwards is writing The Religious Affections. In some ways, they're both wrestling with the same thing. They're both wrestling with what status do we grant human feelings and human affections? Because both Rousseau and Edwards know that human feelings and human affections are an important part of who and what we are. They come up with very, very different conclusions, though. I would say they're both part of the history of expressive individualism. One of them I'm prepared to stand with. One of them, I think, is seriously off base on his analysis. So I'd sort of back up and say, don't get me as saying expressive individualism is just terrible. We need to go back to the feudalism of the Middle Ages. No, we don't want to do that. But we need to realize that if this is intuitively how we think of ourselves today, it may help explain some of the things that are most egregious from a Christian perspective about our age. I would say, if you'd asked me to speak about what's wrong in the Middle Ages, or even in the Reformation, I might have said, the problem there is no understanding of individual human dignity. Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, they all acknowledge that human beings, every single human being is made in the image of God. But practically, they think some human beings are much better than others. That the aristocrats are born to rule, and my ancestors were born to serve. I rejoice that I live in a world where my parents didn't go to college, but I did. That's a world made possible by Rousseau in some ways, by expressive individualism. So there are positive things that come from expressive individualism, but we need to be aware that at any given point in time, the way we intuitively imagine what it means to be a human being will have some strengths, but also tilt towards some potential very bad sinful weaknesses as well.
All right. Much has been said about the way the news and social media polarize us, often perhaps by publicizing the worst extremes of the other side. So how does one walk the line between staying well-informed and overreacting?
Well, I certainly, there are a number of reasons I don't do Twitter. One of them is I haven't got time. The other one is that I know that I would be tempted to say something stupid. And I was on a panel last year with a guy called Ilya Shapiro, talking about social media. And Ilya Shapiro is actually he's a liberal, a Jewish guy. Some of you may know the name because he's the guy at Georgetown who basically lost. They didn't fire him, but they exonerated him in such a way that it was clear they were going to fire him as soon as he crossed the line again. He was the guy who late one night put out a tweet about President Biden saying, I want to choose an African-American woman as the next Supreme Court justice. Burden of his tweet was essentially, that cuts us off from most of the best progressive and liberal justices in the nation. He was not a conservative. He was sort of essentially saying, no, you need to cast your net wider because there are better progressives out there. That finished him. And on this panel, I made the comment that if I'm going to torch my career, I want to do it for a whole paragraph. Not for a late night tweet. I want to go down for something substantial. So first of all, I think on Twitter, I'm not sure that it has any positive function. If you're the kind of person who feels they might respond intemperately online on Twitter, just get off Twitter. It doesn't fulfill any useful function. How do you, if you are writing online, I resolved, I think in about 2014, 2015, that I would not put anything up online that wasn't vetted by at least one editor. So if you see something by me, published online by me today, it's been through at least one editor. If it's at First Things, there are at least 3 editors who look at stuff going up on the First Things website. Doesn't mean that stupid stuff doesn't get through the cracks, but it certainly puts a real barrier, a time barrier and a personnel barrier between you and saying something really bad on the internet. In terms of being informed, I would say subscribe to good news journals, left and right. I get the Wall Street Journal each day. I read the op-eds and I try to read some of the articles as well. I can't do it every day. One thing I like about the Wall Street Journal, 3 things. One, the reportage is generally from a more left perspective, so you're getting a perspective that I don't naturally fit with myself. Secondly, the op-eds are by and large from a more conservative perspective. And thirdly, if the Wall Street Journal isn't approximating the truth, it will lose its readership because people read that to get a handle on the markets and things like this. And if the Wall Street Journal isn't somewhat respectful of empirical realities, it will lose its readership. So I find the Wall Street Journal helpful. And then I subscribe to First Things, for which I write, which gives a sort of conservative religious perspective. I also subscribe to New Polity, which is a journal produced, it's a more Catholic-inclined political journal. And I also subscribe to the London Review of Books, which is a very left-wing journal, and it's book reviews, but always done with a strongly progressive slant. I subscribe to the London Review of Books because it is the best and most intelligent writing with which I disagree, if I could put it that way. And I find that really helpful. It's kind of funny, the other week I was reading this article in the London Review Book and I recognized the name. It was a lad who'd been in the youth group that my wife and I used to run in a Presbyterian church in Aberdeen in the late 1980s. He's gone off to become a significant Marxist geographer. And I recognized him, and I dropped him a note and I said, hey, Fraser, loved the article, basically disagreed with it, but really enjoyed being challenged to think in the way that you presented your arguments. So I subscribe to a number of journals that give me a a varied perspective on things. And then there are a lot of websites you can read, but I tend to go for websites where I know the stuff has been, if not refereed, at least gone through a rigorous editorial policy. And there are certain Substacks that I would consider subscribing to as well. But generally I would do that after being recommended by friends I trust, that they've subscribed and found the commentary good. There's a wealth of stuff out there, and you can find it. Again, technology is great, and it allows me to read a whole variety of opinions that I would otherwise have had difficulty getting access to. It's just a question of identifying who are the serious progressives out there. You don't read something you disagree with. I don't read an idiot progressive. I want to read an intelligent, serious progressive, in the same way that I don't want to read an idiot conservative. I want to read a serious, intelligent conservative.
All right, very good. These last two questions are more geared toward their advice for parents. How should or can parents balance shielding kids from the world and teaching kids how to live in the world, and they, specifically regarding the LGBTQ?
Yeah, it's very hard. I think, first of all, church attendance. You've got to teach your kids that church is important. They've got to be in church with you, and they've got to be learning the stuff that church is teaching. So I think unless you are taking your children to church, and then they're sitting under good preaching and finding a strong community there, then anything else you do will have comparatively little significance. Secondly, no smartphones. I really don't think that giving kids smartphones serves any good purpose. I mean, you give your kid a smartphone, you're allowing the most evil perverts in the entire universe direct access to your child. That's just the way it is. And as your kids grow, they will be better at technology than you are. So it doesn't matter how many safety valves you put on their phone, they will find a way around them. You would not buy your kid a season ticket to the local pornographic cinema. If you did that, you would be regarded as, at best, hopelessly misguided. If you give kids a smartphone, that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. Now, I'm conscious when I say that I never had to face that issue with my own children, because thankfully they grew up before smartphones were an issue. And I'm confident that when you tell your kids they can't have a smartphone, they will hate you for it. But that's part of what being a parent is. I did do things that my kids hated me for, but that's part of being a responsible parent. So I would say no smartphones. Thirdly, we always try to teach our kids every human being is an individual who is worthy of respect and of humane treatment. And I think you can model that in your own life. You can model that in the way you talk about other people around the dinner table. So I think model in your own lives what respect for people that you disagree with, maybe people that you strongly disagree with, looks like. And pray that your children will follow the patterns that you set.
Okay, so last question. What are some general bits of advice to parents of students approaching college age, and what do you think are the greatest dangerous threats to the health and integrity of Christian colleges like Grove City?
I think, advice for kids, I think certainly encourage them to continue their strong church attendance when they go to college. When my boys were young, we never encouraged them actually to become members of the church until they'd gone to college, because I said to Katrina, if my kids profess before they go to college, in my heart of hearts, they probably won't believe it until they've actually left home and continue to go to church themselves. That's not to say your kids shouldn't profess faith before college, but it was the way I was thinking in my mind. Encourage them to find a church early and commit to the church. I think you can go either way on the Christian education versus secular education. Often you find in Christian institutions, you can find a lot of hypocrisy. I think it's always easier to explain non-Christian hypocrisy than Christian hypocrisy, which is kind of a case for a secular school. My oldest son went to the University of Pennsylvania, and the youngest one went to Georgetown. Well, Georgetown is Catholic in name only. I mean, it's a very, very progressive university. But both of them had good educations. The headlines are always about the woke stuff going on campus. And my kids have been out for a few years, so things may have changed. But I think a lot of schools still offer a good, beneath the headlines, you can still get a good education in a lot of schools. If your kids are making good friends and they're grounded in a church, then that's a lot, that's a huge foundation. I would say that you can get good, cheap, small liberal arts colleges are increasingly the only places where you can get a more traditional education. So I would say, it's rather self-serving as I teach at a small liberal arts college to say, consider us. But I think, you can come to us for a third of the price. You could go to another college and probably get just as good an education. And if I can make a shameless sales plug, be taught by the professors who are on the websites rather than the junior research assistant of their research assistants. We actually teach classes. One of the dangers facing Christian education, I think, is always I think at this moment in time, I think that the temptations are twofold. One, there is a temptation to become an all-out form of culture war. That one goes down the line that higher education, we take the bait from the progressive schools. Say, okay, higher education, it's all about advocacy, but we're going to do it from a right-wing Christian perspective rather than a left-wing progressive perspective. I think that's a temptation. That's a real danger in some schools. And I think the other temptation is we have to be respectable. We have our reputation as, the Yale of Christian schools or something, and therefore, we don't want to be above the fold on the front page of the New York Times because we didn't allow an LGBTQ group to form on campus. So I think that those pressures are great. Places like Grove and Hillsdale, we're slightly insulated from them. Patrick Henry, because we don't take government money, which means that we have a little bit more leeway. It doesn't mean we're immune to pressures by any stretch, because there are other ways they can get you than government money and Title IX. But small colleges that don't take government money, I think, have a little bit of an edge at the moment.
Okay. So, all right. So, Carl, so you write at First Things, and I have a good friend who sends those to me all the time. So I never subscribe, but he does.
Oh, so you don't pay my
I
small
don't
stipend,
pay.
then.
I don't.
So
No,
I'm working for you for free.
No, I click the X every time the box pops up, but my friend I think does. But he gets them to me, and I enjoy them. There's also a podcast that you do
with Todd Pruitt,
with one of my friends.
Yeah, a Houston native. Todd
Houston native, Todd
PCA
Pruitt.
pastor in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
Yeah, and so some of these guys, and you've got your books, you write at First Things and other places. I guess World sometimes.
Yeah.
And but some folks may know you from the podcast, others may not have heard about it. Tell them a little about Mortification of Spin and kind of what's it like?
Its origins lay in, I think it was around about 2009. All the famous, important people at the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals.
We call them major pastors.
All the major pastors left to join the Gospel Coalition. So it was like me left and one or two others. And Bob Brady, the chief executive, and I say chief executive, this is a group that employs about 6 people, says to me, hey, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd love to do a podcast with my friend Todd Pruitt. It was the early days of podcasting, so we would get together and we just talk about anything that was interesting to us. Since then, we built a little bit of a following. We try to get guests on. Not all of our guests are Reformed. We've had Catholic guests. We try to get the best person on the issue that we are discussing. That's been our philosophy. So if person X is not somebody that we would have as a member of our church, but they have written this book or this article that is the best thing, then we'll have them. So recently I interviewed Abigail Favale, professor at Notre Dame, who is a gender theorist, and her book, The Genesis of Gender, published by Ignatius Press, I think is the best thing from a Christian perspective on the theoretical aspects of the transgender question. Very accessible, should be on the shelf of every pastor. I interviewed Abigail Favale. She's a Roman Catholic. She's not a Protestant, but I have no hesitation in trying to get the best person, because what we're trying to do is have conversations that put books and ideas into the minds of pastors that they will find helpful.
It's about 30 minutes, right?
It's about, yeah, I speak for about 5, Todd speaks for about 20, Guest speaks for about 2.5. Isn't that the way it goes?
That's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. And Todd's a good mutual friend. I text with Todd every day about random things. Todd is on Twitter.
He is. I describe him as not a conspiracy theorist, but as conspiracy theorist adjacent.
Yes,
I would say on
yes.
Twitter.
No, I think that's accurate. All right, so Carl is going to be around for only about 10 or 15 minutes. So even my commitment to him and to his bride is that at 2:20, even if there's a line waiting to talk to him, I'm going to whisk him away, get him back to the hotel. Okay, so I'm letting you know I'm not trying to be mean. All right, you guys know how nice and how sweet I am, but I am going to do that. He's going to be here to preach tomorrow at 8:30 and 11. The hour in between the two worship services, our church's supported missionaries and local ministry partners are going to have tables and booths out on Main Street. They're going to be out there, so it's a great opportunity for you to get to know your missionaries if you're a member, regular attendee here at our church. And so tomorrow's going to be a great day. We're excited about it. Thank you guys for coming. It's my understanding that we were able to record the lectures today, and so they should be up on the website, and it should be easy to find. If you can't find them easily, ask Julio. But that's it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. You're dismissed.